Okay, well, as everybody's still entering the room, good morning and welcome to today's program on extremism panel, terrorism, violent extremism, and the war in Ukraine. My name is Hari Ingram. I am a senior research fellow here at the program, and I will be chairing today's event. Now, we have an excellent panel who will be exploring how the world's violent extremists, from Salafi jihadists to white supremacists, have responded to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. As always, our format for today will be about 10 minutes of opening remarks from each of our speakers, followed by a discussion that will then transition into a Q&A. On that point, please do not wait until the end to submit your questions. Send them through as soon as they come to mind. I want to ensure that we get through as many questions as possible, so do try to get in early. As I said before, we have an excellent panel today with Mina Al-Lami, editorial lead for jihadist media monitoring team at the BBC Monitoring. We have Kasper Rakavic, postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. And of course, our own senior research fellow, Bennett Clifford from the program on extremism. To start us off today, it's over to you, Mina.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the program on extremism for inviting me to share our observations at BBC Monitoring. I'll talk about two things. First, jihadist positions on the war in Ukraine, and then their reactions to it and how they're trying to exploit it. So overall, jihadists have been very interested in the war, especially early on. A lot of the debates, the discussions on Telegram and other platforms were really dominated by updates from the war, as jihadists were trying to navigate and find out what their response should be. And in terms of their positions, jihadists were divided. So, and this is in the early days especially. So, and these divisions were along existing fault lines between a camp of pragmatic jihadists and hardliners. And pragmatic jihadists who really they think that the jihadist movement should show some flexibility in order to survive, whereas the hardliners think that there can be no compromise. And the pragmatic camp, and in this camp, you have groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or known by the acronym HTS. It used to be an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, but now it's not. And the two groups, Al-Qaeda and HTS, are rivals. So officials of HTS really from the beginning, expressed unreserved solidarity with Ukrainians. So they thought that Muslims should support Ukrainians, and that position was really based on Russia's involvement in the conflict in Syria. So they said to Ukrainians, we feel for you. They drew parallels between Syrians and Ukrainians, and they said, we went through the same thing. We're still experiencing the same thing, and that's where that solidarity came from. But also the clerics within this pragmatic camp of jihadists also tried to justify their position. And I say justify because there was a backlash against them by the hardliners. I mean, this situation divided the jihadist movement. So they justified it saying that in Islam, Muslims are obliged to show support for the oppressed anywhere, regardless of their religion. So that was the pragmatic camp. Now, having said that, they didn't say, so groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and their supporters, they didn't say, oh, Muslims should now go to Ukraine and fight. They didn't say that, but they did offer their sympathy and support. And actually, one HTS official, Abu Maria, said that Muslims who die fighting in Ukraine will die as martyrs. So that was the pragmatic position. Now you have the hardliners, and in that camp is groups like Al-Qaeda and so-called Islamic State or ISIS and their supporters, as well as a number of independent influential clerics, such as Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. They were very happy with the war, gloating also about the death and destruction in Ukraine, saying, look at these scenes, we've experienced this in Syria and Iraq, and now they're experiencing this death and destruction. So there was a lot of gloating and hope that the war will be prolonged and it will engulf other countries. But their position is that, and they argued in religious terms, that it was not permissible upon Muslims to support any side. They should not side with Ukraine and they should not side with Russia. As these hardliners explained it, and IS in its official messaging said, this is a crusader on crusader war. We have nothing to do with it. We should not risk our lives fighting with either side. Their position is that they have to exploit it, but not take sides. So that was the hardline position. And on the back of that position that Muslims must not take side, they strongly condemned the involvement of some Chechens in the war alongside Russia. So there have been some Chechen units fighting alongside Russia. And there was a strong condemnation from jihadists, both pragmatic and hardliners, against that participation. There was strong condemnation for videos that showed Muslim Chechens performing, the Muslim prayers before heading to the battlefront. So they said, this has nothing to do with us. This is what the jihadists said. This is as far as the positions on the war is concerned. Now, if we're talking about responses and how to exploit it, again, I'll divide it into two. One was indirect. So jihadists overall and broadly have seen the war as a welcome development, because they reckon that it will distract the West, the US, NATO, Europe, from focusing on conflicts in Muslim majority countries. And that leaves the jihadists to operate more freely and get on with their activities and even grow. So that was the position. And you can hear that position in the leadership message of ISIS this month. So the leadership of ISIS talked about, they incited attacks in the West. And they said, how come there have been no attacks in the West for some time? But then ISIS linked that to the war in Ukraine, saying, you should take advantage of the war in Ukraine because the West will be distracted, and that leaves you to carry out attacks in the West. So that was kind of direct and indirect, operational, use the distraction to stage attacks in European countries, in the US and elsewhere. Now, on the more kind of operational side, we haven't had a lot of instructions to jihadists to actively go and exploit the war in a way to benefit them, but there has been one very clear example, and that is the pro-Al-Qaeda magazine, Wolves of Manhattan. Now, I have to say, this is not an official Al-Qaeda magazine, and within the jihadist community doesn't have a very long established standing. Nevertheless, it is an important piece of propaganda and publication from jihadist groups. So in their latest issue, which came out in early April, Wolves of Manhattan told Muslims in the West, sympathizers, would-be jihadists, that they should exploit the ease to travel to Ukraine. It said Ukrainian borders are now open, and not just open, but they're welcoming foreign volunteers to help the Ukrainian army fight Russia. So use that, travel to Ukraine in small cells or individuals and form cells there to go to Ukraine, get training, because the Ukraine in February, the Ukrainian president invited people from various parts of the world to come and help in the effort to fight Russia. So they said, join that International Legion of Fighters and gain training, gain weapons, but not to use them in the battle against Russia, but to then stage attacks against crusaders, whether crusaders inside, in their language, crusaders inside Ukraine or in Russia, or use that outside. When you go back home to your own countries, use that training and expertise to stage attacks. They also said that today in Ukraine there are many foreign teams, media teams, logistical teams, diplomatic teams. Everyone's there in Ukraine or around the border, so you have plenty of targets to choose from. The magazine also advised jihadists to engage in disinformation. They said this is, again, a golden opportunity to get in and spread rumors that would complicate the war, blur it even further, create chaos, because jihadists thrive on chaos. Any chaos for them is distraction, especially if it's chaos away from their conflict areas. It's a distraction. So one of for example, the ideas it gave is you need to drive a wedge between Ukrainian refugees and the host countries that are where, the European host countries that are taking them. Drive a wedge, create some kind of, ethnic conflict. This is all as part of their efforts to get their what they call enemies distracted so they can operate freely. And I'll finish this by finally saying that that the development, what's happening, the war in Ukraine, even before that, jihadists overall, their view was that the West was in retreat, not in retreat, doing nothing, but is in retreat from Muslim conflict zones. They saw what happened in in Afghanistan last year with the US and NATO withdrawal. And of course, Taliban ended up taking power. They looked at the downscaling of France in Africa's Sahel, in West Africa. And of course, France is now withdrawing from Mali. They looked at those two things. And prior to that, they looked at, the US's not distraction, but it's preoccupation with, we had the COVID, we had the pandemic, across, of course, with Europe as well. We had the pandemic, the race wars, the race protests, not wars, the race protests, the polarization, political polarization. So they looked at all of these things, and they usually kind of define this in apocalyptic and divine, punishment. And they looked at that, and they reckoned that the West is in retreat. The West is preoccupied with its own problems, and it's too busy. It's looking away. And while the West is looking away, let us regroup. Let us enhance our operations, and let us expand. So this is what jihadists are looking to do. And of course, with the war in Ukraine, they see this as an enhancement of that worldview, that changing worldview, where the West is in retreat or it's focused on its problems. And this is where they think they can make gains. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mina. That was fantastic. Casper, you're up next. Thank you. Sorry, Casper, your audio is not coming through.
Is it any better now?
It's very soft.
And it's any better now, maybe.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, super,
Gotcha.
super. So thank you for having me. Thanks, Haroro, for giving me the floor, and thank you to all the people who decided to join us. I think we're across quite a few continents, and thank you, Mina, for the fascinating presentation of the jihadi subset, if I could put it this way. I mean, I'm going to look at the extremists mostly in Europe, mostly of the far right, let's say, persuasion. They are, the one difference with Mina's cohort is that they actually, some of them tried or did join the conflict. And they are probably at a slightly less geopolitical level of analysis than, if the West fights there, then it's weaker, etc., etc. It's less fascinating, but at the same time, it's probably more mind-blowing for some of our audience. So actually, to ascertain all of this, we need to look at two things: the input and the output. And I'll explain what I mean by these two terms. The input is essentially what I define, and there will be a paper by me coming out by Counter-Extremism Project recently, so I'll happily, I of course encourage you to have a look at it. The input is about a lot of talking in those nationalist scenes, as they call themselves, nationalist, far right, white supremacy, neo-Nazi, what have you, far right. There is a lot of talk among these individuals about the war in Ukraine. They want to go there. They fundraise for the war. Some of them did go. Some of them cheer their comrades who decided to go, but there is a lot of talking, really. Now, this is the input level. Now, the output level are the units fighting in Ukraine, which have a track record of fielding foreigners. And these are some of the units that I will discuss. Of course, that includes the beloved, inverted commas, Azov, of which you probably all have heard about, but there are also others. So we need to look at the output level in terms of how many these units are actually showing us, what they are discussing. And do believe me that if they had many foreigners and if they had many foreign extremists, they would be telling us. Now, we have to look at these two, let's say, we have to look at these two scales and bear in mind the fact that this mobilization of foreign volunteers, not foreign fighters, is actually very different from the mobilization that took place for Ukraine and for the so-called separatists, inverted commas, for the 2014 part of the war. So it's not the first one. Please do remember about that. The previous one was much more clandestine, and it was much more ideological, because you really had to convince yourself that going is worth, doing. And it was pretty blurry. Is it really the case? Russia convinced quite a few of us that this was a civil war. It wasn't. It was a Russia-Ukraine war from the get-go, but quite a few people actually interpreted it that way, and they didn't want to participate in that. So really, mostly the ideological ones decided to go, and some of the ideological ones, if not majority of them, were coming from the far right. But there was a very interesting element of the far left fighters as well, and there were also fighters who kind of straddled the two milieus, the kind of red-brown, brown-red type of a conglomerate, which obviously was very prominent, especially on the separatist side. So please do bear that in mind. So it's the second mobilization. The previous one was different. Why? This one is essentially conducted in the open. Ukraine basically collects files of these guys. This is a mobilization for individuals to join official paramilitary units of a fighting, of one of the sides of the war. So the Territorial Defense Force of Ukraine. So please do remember about that. That is a major difference here. But devil's in the details, as always. There are people who are kind of leftovers from the first mobilization who are still fighting in this very war, or some people who return to this very war. And some of them, if I could put it this way, are my customers and are of interest to us in this very conversation. But essentially, let's look input-output. Okay, so input. A lot of talk in different nationalist, far-right, neo-Nazi, white supremacy scenes around Europe. All of these scenes suddenly mostly shifted towards pro-Ukrainian message because, A, Russia is no longer popular because it's so outright, and it had been very popular because it's so outrightly invaded Ukraine, and it didn't hold anything back, really, that, the narrative, the humanitarian narrative of we have to stand up and defend the sovereign nation in our efforts, it really took hold. Then secondly, Russia made a couple of, if I could put it, some interesting moves in terms of narrative and in terms of whom it fielded to fight Ukraine. And that really did make a major splash among the extremists of Europe. So one, it fielded Chechens to fight around Kiev. And that really did, if I could put it, non-diplomatically pissed off the extremists of Europe, who are, really aghast with the thought that the strongman Vladimir Putin, whom they loved, whom they cherished, and they thought that Russia contains zero Muslims, which is of course wrong, suddenly fields those very Muslims who are coming out of nowhere to fight, Ukraine in a very public place around Kiev. They're not fighting in Kharkiv. They were fighting around Kiev, which was, this is where the cameras of the world were. Then secondly, the troops fighting Ukraine are coming from the Eastern Military District, and it's all in the name, really. Eastern Military District is in Asia, therefore its troops, its soldiers look Asian, therefore they don't look European, they're not blonde, they're not Slavic. That is also, wrong type of a message to send to the fans of Vladimir Putin in Europe. They are confused, they're saying, right, we gotta stick with the Ukrainians this time, this is wrong. And obviously the Russian troops quite often fly the flag of the Soviet Union. Now, again, you are talking about the far-right milieu. It's no wonder that they, again, are aghast and they're saying, hang on, Vladimir Putin is a communist. That is not something that we really expected him to be. Therefore, we should side with Ukraine. So please do not presuppose that these individuals have some kind of deep love for Ukraine. No, what you see is that they're aghast with the messaging coming from Russia and actually adding on top of that their own messaging, saying suddenly that Vladimir Putin is run by a cabal of Jewish oligarchs. Well, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is also, Jewish, but at least he's standing and fighting. Therefore, he's a good Jew. Literally, this is what they're talking about. This is what they're saying. Now, there's a lot of puff, there's a puff, a lot of smoke. Now, the question is, to what extent this translates into numbers? Now, if you look at the numbers, these are disappointing to say the least. You're looking at the biggest European countries contributing with possibly around 20, 30 far-right individuals who actually traveled to Ukraine. Now, how many got to the front line? How many actually fought? That is a completely, that is anybody's guess largely, and that is anybody's guess largely because the units that supposedly should be hosting them, they're not really hosting them, and they're not really talking about them. They're not really showcasing them. And the best story, which I think some of the, especially the US side of the audience will be surprised with, that the one unit that is always picked up in the American discussion, so-called Azov Battalion, which no longer exists, by the way, it's the Azov Regiment and the Azov Movement. The units associated with that very socio-political movement, which are which used to fight around Kiev, the territorial defense forces basically dominated, elements of the territorial defense forces basically dominated by Azovian veterans. These units do not recruit foreigners. They're adamant about that. All the communications in Ukrainian, they're saying that we will not have you if you're foreign. They're not showcasing them. And the one effort that they actually produced to recruit such individuals produced a staggering number of 20 recruits to the cause. Now, if this is a huge number, let's remember about the number of Europeans going to join ISIS, 6,000, if I remember correctly. So, let's weight the scales. Now, when this is not working, there are other contenders of the output side who are actually saying, okay, suddenly this is being internationalized, right? President Zelensky on the 27th of February comes out and says, international volunteers, please join us. There are smaller units, not Azov, who are happy to join the fray and who supposedly are trying to recruit some individuals. And suddenly you see other far-right formations, such as a beautifully named organization called the Battalion Revenge, by the organization Tradition and Order, formerly or currently affiliated with the Azov movement, which is basically winking at foreign volunteers. Again, winking, as it does not have a pretty solid strategy of having them, because it does not beam propaganda in English, French, German, Italian, or stuff like that. But it is saying that, well, if you get to us, to Kiev, we'll have you. Then there is another battalion run by the organization called Bratstvo, or Brotherhood. This is a weird far-right Ukrainian outfit, which has a track record of working with far-right in Russia. So, we can doubt to what extent this is a genuine organization or to what extent this is some kind of a creation or it's playing some games, etc., etc. But this organization, on the back of the war chaos, and this is one point that I would like to stress, and one of the final points that I have, is that this organization picked up some foreign volunteers, but not on the back of its ideological commitment, but on the back that there is so much chaos in relation to the war effort that actually some of the arriving volunteers ended up in this battalion by accident, because this was the first person that they jumped into who could take them on. That was also the fate of some of the Spanish far-right guys who traveled to the country, who were meant to join the Azovian units, but in the fog of war in Kiev, at the time Kiev was quasi under siege, they ended up fighting for another territorial defense battalion, because this was the first one that they came across, and this was the first one saying, guys, if you want to come in, well, here are guns, and you can fight. So you have that immense amount of flux. You have the immense amount of haphazard nature of this whole affair. So therefore, even if you see a far-right Ukrainian unit saying, okay, we have that many, are they really our customers? If I could put it this way, you really have to look into it. But as I said, the numbers are really, really low. And maybe as a final point, let's go to the US. There is a unit called the Georgian National Legion, which has been running recruitment for the war in Ukraine for 8 years. It's not ideological at all, but it has a track record of allowing people to come in if they provide the necessary credentials as, fighters, active, not activists, but paramilitary men usually. And it seems that at least one of the recruits is basically a far-right or white supremacy extremist from the United States, because he slipped through the net in the sense that saying, hey, I'm an American, I want to fight for you. And of course, the Georgian National Legion in this situation says, okay, Americans are coming, you're very welcome. You probably know how to handle a gun. You might have had some experience, while being a soldier here or there. We're going to have you. We're not going to ask those specific questions on how you score on, liberal scorecard and stuff like that. And then you end up with an individual who is basically, who basically you later found out that he is a white supremacy guy. I'll stop there and final point. So maybe just as a summary, there are guys like that, fewer than we think. This is not an extremist mobilization for Ukraine. It really is, and that's a quote from one of the fighters that I interviewed, concerned citizens of the world, really. Amongst them, you will find the extremists, but it's way less than we initially expected. And I'm happy to tackle that in the Q&A. It's not all Azov. It's hardly Azov at all.
Excellent. Thank you, Caspar, for those opening remarks. And I just want to remind our guests today, please use the Q&A function to send through your questions and your comments, and I'll be sure to direct them to the panelists. And it's over to you, Bennett. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aurora, and thanks to Mina and Kasper for their excellent presentations as well. I'll be talking about the impact, or I guess really more of the potential second and third order effects of the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion in Ukraine on the jihadist movement that Russia's had at home for a long period of time. And I'll be mainly focusing on the North Caucasus region of Russia, where the movement has been most pronounced historically, especially during the late 1990s and early 2000s. But hopefully, both at the very end of my presentation as well as during the question and answers, I'll have some time to make some quick remarks about other types of violent extremism in Russia or in the broader region at the end. But before I start, I think it's helpful to sort of sketch out where the Russian-speaking jihadist movement was at the beginning of the war with sort of a brief history. And a lot of this, in terms of the beginning of the end, really starts in the early 2010s. When you have the twilight years of what was a 20-year-long insurgency in the North Caucasus that, as time went on, began to develop what you could say would be like a stronger jihadist tenor, especially as the insurgency was organized under the banner of the movement Imarat Kavkaz, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate at the time. But in 2012 and 2013, there were a confluence of factors that sort of led to the beginning of the end of this period. The first and the big one was the opening up of the battlefield in Syria. And this develops in Russia and neighboring countries in a way that it really doesn't when you talk about other contexts globally, which is that at the time, Russian law enforcement had a long list of identified sort of quote unquote radicals that they had in their database at the time of the Syrian conflict open up, and you actually have local offices of the FSB, Russia's federal law enforcement services, at times providing assistance to local jihadists to essentially get them out of the country and travel overseas. They would usually put them on a bus from the North Caucasus to Turkey and then onward from Turkey into Syria. And as a result of this outflow, you're talking about numbers of several thousands of individuals from Russia who eventually make it into Syria and Iraq to join jihadists. Meanwhile, after all that's happened, the FSB went through and swept up and through counter-terrorism operations, arrested or killed any remaining leaders of Imarat Kavkaz. So you have the death of the leader Toko Umarov in 2013. About a year after that, his successor Alyashkhab Kebekov is killed. And then months after him, the last leader of Imarat Kavkaz, Magomed Suleimanov, is killed in 2015 as well. And the result of both of these things happening at the same time, the foreign fighter outflow and the deaths of the leaders, which were also conducted before the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics in order to prevent any threat to the games. All these factors leave jihadism in Russia in any format higher than the small cell level highly degraded. And this continues until today. Because even though groups like the Islamic State tried to establish its province in the North Caucasus in 2015, you could call this a wilaya name only. There's no command or control or infrastructure, and its only leader was killed again in a counterterrorism operation in Dagestan shortly after his announcement as leader. So you can today still argue that the locus of the Russian jihadist movement is in Syria, not in Russia. But even in Syria, we're talking about very limited numbers from their peak about 7 years ago. Today, you can say most of the foreign fighters from Russia and its neighbors are dead. They joined ISIS and were killed in Mosul and Raqqa during the sieges and takebacks of those cities. There's been a number of women and children of Russian origin who were detained in the Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps, a large number of which have been repatriated back to Russia. So who's remaining in the Syrian theater is a very small number of those affiliated with HTS and independent factions in Idlib as well. This all goes to say none of the Russian jihadis currently in Syria are really in any position, capacity, nor do they have their interest, or I'll talk about in a second, to travel back to Russia or to Ukraine to participate in the conflict there. But the elephant in the room, just as it did 10 or even 20 years ago, remains sort of the simmering radicalization problem that's never really been addressed in the North Caucasus. Essentially, since the fall of the Soviet Union, you've had a unique combination of political, demographic, and socioeconomic factors that has continuously sustained the jihadist scene in Russia and provided it a large group of young followers, particularly in specific regions of Russia that sustain sort of these formations of individuals in small cells that remains a prominent underground movement, especially in the North Caucasus, even till today. Between 2015 and today, there have been over 24 jihadist attacks in various regions of Russia that were claimed by the Islamic State. And in response to this, Russia responds to the only tool really that it has in its toolbox, which are its so-called counter-terrorism operations, which are using special police and law enforcement to arrest or more often than not kill suspects with very literal regard for collateral damage during these operations, which in short term reduces the leadership and the capacity to develop longer term insurgency or bigger structures, but also breeds resentment and violent extremism. So that's sort of where we're left off at the eve of the Ukraine war. But I think in the medium to long term, there's a couple things to look at as the war develops in terms of what could happen to Russian jihadism. And I want to stress here that any kind of short-term immediate impact is very unlikely. And I am relying on a lot of speculation about what could happen based off, of course, the events on the ground, both in Ukraine, but then also in Russia, which are highly subject to change in and of itself. I agree with Mina's assessment about jihadism writ large with regards to Russians, that they're very unlikely to mobilize to fight in Ukraine, but are very likely to cheer on the violence from afar. And with Russians, it'll especially be true if it ends up degrading Russian military or law enforcement capabilities. Any group that Russian jihadists are currently allied with has stopped short of encouraging foreign fighter travel. There are some battalions of individuals from the North Caucasus, as mentioned before, particularly Chechens, who are fighting on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. For Ukraine, it's largely individuals who are involved with the Chechen separatist and nationalist campaigns during the 1990s, and with Russia, it's the so-called Kadyrovtsi, the personal militia of Ramzan Kadyrov. Both of these formations, for reasons that I can talk a little bit more about in the question and answer period, are very, very unlikely to draw any sort of jihadist support based off infighting that's occurred between the jihadist movements and these groups in the past. The second thing that's more broad is that Russian regions that played host to the jihadist insurgency in the past, and especially in this case the North Caucasus, are likely to be disproportionately affected by the second and third order effects of the war. I'm talking politically, socially, economically, and a lot of these factors could have an effect on increasing push factors for radicalization in the region. And the most important of these things is the security situation. Security forces from the North Caucasus are being disproportionately deployed to Ukraine. This includes the Kadyrovtsi, who are being deployed in several regions of Ukraine as a subgroup of the Russian National Guard, the Rosgvardia. But you also have contingents of special police and military from neighboring republics in the North Caucasus, such as Dagestan and Ingushetia. And these regions are overrepresented in whatever the casualty figures are that are coming out of the war in terms of Russian military. Now, in the coming months in Ukraine, if the focus of the Russian military turns from taking territory to being able to hold it, it's possible to affect or expect further deployments of police units and other types of units from the North Caucasus to those regions, because they are some of the few sort of police capacities that Russia has that have some sort of experience or institutional memory of conducting a counterinsurgency, particularly if this turns into the case in the Ukraine. And then also you have socioeconomic situation as well. The North Caucasus republics are among the poorest regions in Russia. They are highly subsidized by the federal government. And the long-term economic problems in Russia would be felt especially strongly in these regions as well. Economics have not been a central driver of the insurgency or jihadism in the North Caucasus, but more from the social perspective of youth in the North Caucasus about lack of prospects, lack of a future, corruption that goes on as well. That could have a material effect, as could second-order effects in the neighboring countries of Russia and in Central Asian states, which is, again, something I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer, because I see I'm quickly running out of time here. The last thing I'll say is about sort of the political ramifications, and this is sort of the wild card. Vladimir Putin, and especially the folks that he's appointed to be governors in the North Caucasus, and again, especially Ramzan Kadyrov, are politically mutually dependent on one another. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which one of them could stay in power while the other one can't, because Kadyrov and his ilk are essentially given carte blanche to suppress the terrorism-related situation in the North Caucasus. In turn, Putin gets to claim the political win that he solved the separatism and insurgency problems that Russia faced in the 1990s and 2000s. Nobody's gambled on the Ukraine war in terms of security services more than Kadyrov. But the more he supports forward deployments and extraterritorial deployments of his forces, the less control he'll have over the situation at home, especially as the evidence is shaping up. There's more potential for his forces to be viewed either as paper tigers or, as the Ukrainian soldiers call them, TikTok soldiers because they don't seem to have a lot of combat effectiveness despite a lot of the hype as well. So I think in a long run, a lot of these political dynamics could galvanize jihadists to step up their operations, especially if they perceive the weakness of the Russian security services. And with that, I'll turn it back to Hiroro.
Fantastic, Bennett. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. And look, it just makes sense to start, I guess, with Casper. Bennett's just spoken about the jihadists in Russia. I mean, could you give us some idea of how big Russia's neo-Nazi and far-right milieu is? You know, not just in terms of numbers, but, you know, I'm curious about its characteristics, the kind of threat that it poses, the kind of regional reach that it may have. I mean, I suppose, give us the far-right neo-Nazi version of Bennett's last few minutes.
Yeah, I'll try my best. Thank you for that, Herrero. I would say this, we all focus on one entity in Ukraine, the Azov movement, whose political party got 18 councillors elected in the last local elections, and you elect 43,000 councillors in Ukraine. They got 18. Now, I'll give you another statistic to kind of like, you know, maybe, you know, provide a spark for our imagination. The Russian neo-Nazis killed in terrorist attacks 500 people between the years of 2000 and 2017. 500, not 50, not 5. This is way, way more than, for example, in the territory of the European Union, which also has a population of like 4 times or 3.5 times. So that tells you how active this milieu used to be. This is a milieu that was used and abused, I would say, driven, ridden by the government. So if you want to beat up liberals and LGBT and the Democrats, you use them, but then you turn on them so that they don't feel too comfortable. You break them up and you put them together and you send them to the war in Donbass saying, look, Andrea, your file will disappear from the FSB if you go and neatly fight in Ukraine and if you do your duty for the country. So this is the extent of how they're working with the neo-Nazi milieu. It is mostly broken and shackled in a way, but these individuals are still there. And I'll give you one personal story from Moscow. If you were a student in Russia on an exchange in Moscow, in early May, and especially in late April, when the birthday of Adolf Hitler was celebrated by certain milieu in Moscow, you as a foreigner were advised not to leave your dormitory, student dormitory, because there was so much happening in the street. Okay, this is something from many years back, but this tells you how infested this country is with that type of a nationalist leading to neo-Nazi, white supremacy, call it whatever you like, rhetoric and reality. You have these figures still there. They can be resurrected. They can play the role of gatekeepers, recruiters, etc., like they did for the war in 2014. You know, you had not only the Russian imperial movement, but basically any organization on the far right of Russia was recruiting fighters for the war in 2014 and pretending that they have nothing to do with the Russian state, that this is a kind of like a bottom-up mobilization. I would say it's a tiger with, you know, with claws that have been removed, but it's still a tiger.
So as we move from talking about, say, the far right, and I suppose back to the jihadist, Mina, I'm interested to know, what do the jihadists think of the far right? I mean, when there, for example, historically, there has been high-profile terrorist attacks, how jihadists have responded to the far right, and whether and I guess how those perceptions have changed dependent on the group or dependent on the allegiance. I know that there was quite a bit made of, I think there was various articles about chatter online in jihadist circles about the far right and whether or not, well, you know, your enemy's enemy. I'm curious to know what that history is and whether there's been any response now.
I think I wouldn't say jihadists talk a lot about the far right in their day-to-day discussions. But one thing actually that you reminded me about one of the key angles that they've been discussing on the war in Ukraine, and it's not necessarily about the far right, but it is about what they call the double standards of the West. So they've looked at the travel, or Ukraine's invitation to foreign volunteers to come and fight against Russia, and they said, hold on, this is double standards. So why is it when foreign fighters go to Syria to fight, they are called terrorists? And what jihadists try to do, they try to flip that. They say the people who are down going to Ukraine, these are the far right. And they try to promote this narrative that Europe and the West is allowing the far right to grow. They are allowing and enabling the far right to go to Ukraine and fight on the one hand, and yet they label the foreign fighters going to Muslim conflict zones as jihadists. These are foreign fighters and these are jihadists. So the jihadists are trying to play that and say these people who are traveling are far right, and yet they are, described as freedom fighters. And what they're trying to do, they know that this kind of strikes a chord more broadly, because that criticism directed at the West of double standards echoes what some Muslims in the Middle East and in other Muslim countries were saying, is that some European politicians were encouraging the travel to Ukraine to help the Ukrainian government fight Russia. And of course, what jihadists don't say here is that with a lot of the foreign fighters who went to fight in Syria ended up joining global jihadist groups whose target is not really just to fight the Assad regime government, but to expand further. So there's that. And the thing is with these two groups, there's a lot of overlap in terms of on different fronts, but in terms of the narrative, the tactics, the platforms that they use, the way they're trying to incite and to stir trouble. There's a lot of overlap there, but it's only really when there is a big attack or a big development involving the far right, like the Christchurch, that's when they actually jump on that and and they try to use that and say, see, there is a war against Islam, So they always try to use the far right to scare Muslims and say, see, we've been right all along. We've said that there's a war against Islam, and this is the evidence. This is the proof.
Bennett, and I think that that our participants would benefit from hearing a bit more about those medium to long-term implications, and just tying in bits of what Casper and Mina have said so far. I mean, particularly curious about the perception of these Putin-friendly Chechen forces within Russia's jihadist milieu and beyond. It seems that would be a point of kind of great contention and tension and animosity. Could you speak a little about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things they're looking at is sort of this is the first sort of major deployment in which Ramzan Kadyrov's personal militia are fighting not a non-state actor, but are actually going toe-to-toe with a state-organized military. And I think so far a lot of the weaknesses in sort of deploying that force for that purpose are being shown, I think, to some regard. I mean, predominantly, while they have, I guess, a lot more social media presence, a lot better kit, and a lot more will to fight in some circumstances than a lot of the other special units that Russia has deployed in Ukraine. Overall, I think a lot of the reaction, not just from jihadists, but from the rest of the world, is showcasing some of the limits of this type of force in deployment as well. Now, I think previous to that, I mean, the first situation under which these forces cut their teeth was in Chechnya itself, during the end of the Second Chechen War, where, essentially they were used to brutally subdue not just the jihadist movement, but any domestic political opponents of Ramzan Kadyrov as well. The dispute between jihadists and Kadyrov is not merely a matter of political control or sort of I guess, adversarial reaction based off of the decades of insurgency and counterinsurgency, but it also is deeply ideological as well. Kadyrov and his followers within Chechnya are representatives, or I guess adherents, of a Sufist sort of Muslim strand that's been predominant in Chechnya for the past several hundred years, that at its core, and especially the way that Kadyrov deploys this form of Islam to justify his own motives, and strictly contradicts the ideologies and the nature of Salafi jihadist groups, both in terms of the ritual practices, but then also in terms of what's considered legitimate political demonstrations as well. And certainly in this regard, Kadyrov's constant unfailing alliance with Vladimir Putin and collaboration with Russia as a state, which is in many aspects a primordial jihadist enemy, I think is the basis by which a lot of jihadists sort of directly oppose Kadyrov, his rule, his regime, his military forces, and pretty much everything else. I mean, Russian-speaking jihadists notoriously refer to Kadyrov as Kafirov, like kafir meaning an unbeliever, essentially, and have described him as the little Satan, lots of other very fun nicknames that have sort of been put out with the milieu. He's, at least in terms of the jihadist scene in the North Caucasus, primary enemy number one in terms of a local force sort of picture.
Thanks, Bennett. Mina, have you got anything you'd like to add to that, particularly from the more global perspective?
Not to that, but I've seen a number of questions which have a similar theme, and I just wanted to very quickly respond to that. If we've seen any evidence of jihadists actually going to Ukraine and exploiting that, they've been talking about it, but have they done it? We haven't seen any evidence as far as I know. And I think personally, if they were up to no good and they were actually going there, they wouldn't be disclosing that information yet publicly on these forums. They would be doing that quietly. Because, Ukraine also, it's not Syria where they can pop up in Syria and boast about their presence there and go on social media where there are groups and territories that are welcoming, of jihadists. They can't do that. In Ukraine, they can't do that. So I think at this point, we haven't seen any evidence. There haven't been, as far as I know, any thwarted attacks in Europe related to the war in Ukraine. Luckily, there hasn't been that, but I think it's definitely an area to watch. Not that I'm not an alarmist. I'm not saying, oh, be careful. They're saying that, so we have to be careful, but definitely to be vigilant that they do have this in mind. And they could be, that's why they want the war to be a protracted war, to prolong, because the more it drags on, the more opportunities there are.
Casper, we had a few questions here on points of clarification. There was one question there about the numbers. You'd mentioned 20 to 30. If you could just clarify there, and then after you answer that, what are some of the risks? What are some of the potential risks in terms of operational experience, and what are the kind of things that you are concerned about in terms of the numbers, even if the numbers are low? Are there things which, we usually have a big policy audience in, and I think they'd be very interested to hear about what you see as the very real risks, despite the numbers perhaps being smaller than expected.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that, Harora. I would say the 2030 number repeats itself in different constellations. So 20 to 30, it's the number of people brought into Ukraine from abroad by the Azov-related recruitment efforts. So that's one. 20 to 30, it's also the number of potential French far-right individuals who travel to the country. And finally, 20 to 30 is the number of German far-right individuals who travel to the country. Of course, sometimes they are the same individuals, so you cannot just add 20, 20, 20 and you have 60. But in relation, this is how we're looking at it. And in terms of when you asked about the policy-related question, I think, with these extremists, it's okay when we know of them, and when we've seen their faces, they were, sorry to say this, dumb enough to actually showcase their involvement in the war. That's fine. But we need to know who actually else might be there or might have gone there that we don't know about. And I think for this very reason, there is a need that at a certain point in this war, our countries, if you like, start asking this question to Ukraine, because Ukraine has quite a lot of files on these guys, because they're supposedly all going to Lviv, to Territorial Defense Recruitment Center, and they're supposed to present themselves there, passport, for forms, etc., etc., etc. We need to know who was there, and we need to know what they did, where they fought, and if they were involved in any nasty business. And we need to know with whom they actually networked, because there's an interesting one, and I'll finish off on this point. There is quite a group of people that my colleague from Canada, Guillaume Cournot, is monitoring, of guys who fought in YPG and YBS in Syria. Now, and not only Syria, of course, Iraq as well. And these guys have a tendency to pop up in Ukraine as well. You're looking at a group of around 20 to 30, again, 20 to 30 people, you know what a magic number that is. Now, if you couple that with the veterans of the 2014 mobilization on the far right, who fight either on the Ukrainian side, or some of them fight on the pro-Russian side because they stayed over in Donetsk or Luhansk after 2014, you are basically looking at something that I call, and it's my trademark, a Western foreign fighter secret society of guys who travel around different conflicts, who give each other tips, who write recommendations for one another. And of course, if you are a policy person working for security authorities on either side of the Atlantic, you should be interested in such a society. Let's put it this way. That's my major concern.
And that is the perfect segue to the next question, which has come from Jeff Selden of the Voice of America. I'm going to direct this towards Bennett. As I'm sure everybody who's listening in knows, Bennett has published really important work over the years on foreign fighter traveler trends. And the question from Jeff is a broader question about how the war in Ukraine is likely to shape the future landscape of foreign fighters. I think it's a good segue from actually what Casper concluded with there. Bennett, from all of your experience over the years working on this issue, how do you broadly see this impacting foreign fighter kind of dynamics going forward?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately going to have to respond to that question where you've drastically raised the bar on my ability to answer it with sort of lowering it back to the fact that I think that I've studied foreign fighter dynamics in a couple of very specific, you can say peculiar environments. So I don't really think that a lot of my statements can speak for the general mobilization of foreign fighters, just in the circumstances that I've sort of had some chance to study. With that caveat out of the way, I think one thing that's sort of interesting to me is there's been a lot of, especially in the broader literature, drawing parallels and comparisons between previous large-scale mobilizations of foreign fighters. And I think with President Zelensky's announcement, especially that foreign fighters would be incorporated into the territorial defense forces, a lot of this would need to be seen in terms of what the longer-term resolution of the conflict portends. But I think the one thing that reminds me of immediately off the bat is sort of the development of legions of the Bosnian army during the 1990s wars in the Balkans that were made up essentially of foreign volunteers from various countries that after the end of the Dayton Accords were essentially given citizenship in that aspect. And as we know later on, that sort of milieu eventually became among its members sort of the breeding ground for future deployments of the jihadist movement, especially in Europe. Now, I'm not drawing that same analogy between those two things in terms of the long-term extremist development, just that move in and of itself, the long-term granting of citizenship to foreign fighters could have a profound effect, I think, on future developments in the same way that sort of developing that Bosnia precedent has linked into a number of other conflicts as well in terms of the drivers of foreign fighter conflict. But I wouldn't profess myself to be an expert on any of those dynamics, at least in terms of broader things. And Casper actually might be better suited to answer some of these questions in terms of that.
We do have one question here that's been directed towards all the panelists. And I might just jump to that question very quickly. And beginning with Mina, there's a question here about the involvement of women in these dynamics. And I suppose from the jihadist perspective and the monitoring that you do at the BBC, has there been a response in particular from women? And in terms of the other, in terms of Casper and Bennett, just thinking about how you'd respond to that question as well about female involvement. Thanks, Mina.
Yeah, I mean, very shortly and simply, there hasn't really been a role, as far as we can see from the discussions, of women, their own views and narratives on what's happening in Ukraine. And it's worth saying that even though you might read a lot about the women's involvement in jihadist movements and their kind of, at least their online activity, it's very, very small. And some of it has to do with, with jihadists always saying there has to be really strict segregation in activity online between men and women, but also in recent years, there was a big division within the pro-IS jihadist movement online, and it was blamed largely on female supporters who were accused of driving a wedge and using seduction to seduce these IS supporters and divide the movement. So there was a strong backlash against the participation of women, but also they were seen as a source of mistrust and seduction. And then there was this strong push that, we cannot trust the women here. They're here to do something different. So since then, last few years, we haven't really seen a lot. There used to be a lot of very strong female, at least people claiming to be female voices supportive of IS within the social media activity in the early days of ISIS in 2013 and 14. But those gradually disappeared, and we had these household names of jihadist female activists online that simply just disappeared and dropped off. And I would say with the Ukraine war, it's really been no different. We haven't had any input from female jihadist voices.
Casper, on female involvement, but also there is a question on the Georgian National.
Yeah, so on the Georgians, they used to be called the Georgian National Legion. Now they've rebranded themselves as the Georgian Foreign Legion. Since the beginning of the war, they had around 600 recruits coming in from around the world, mostly from the Anglo-Saxon countries. But this is a peculiar unit because they do not fight as one unit. They distribute these fighters around different formations and different groups. They are more like a platform, a hub, if you like. Mostly, and that probably picks up on some of the research also that Bennett was doing. If you speak foreign languages, if you're on the social media, those foreigners will flock to you. And the commander of the Georgian National / Foreign Legion speaks English, speaks French. They hand out the phone numbers of the people from the unit to actually, so that you can actually have a more easy experience while being recruited. That speaks a lot. Now, on the female front, the war attracted very few female volunteers since 2014. And only one family, and it was on the separatist side. Now there were female volunteers in the Ukrainian TDF at the beginning from all sorts of places, Netherlands, Denmark, places like that. Some of them went home already, but again, it is a predominantly male affair. And maybe on one comment to what Bennett was saying about handing out of the citizenship, Ukraine hasn't been very successfully giving out citizenship to its foreign volunteers since 2014. Very, very few actually achieved that. And even if they do, and you rightly alluded to the fact that they will not become the world's next jihadists because this is a completely different war. I get questions about will they be radicalized into something? Those foreigners who stay over, and I always respond, yes, they might be into Ukrainian patriotism. That's a very radical ideology, I can tell you. So I think we should really keep that in mind while discussing issues.
Bennett, I don't know whether you have anything else to add in terms of the question about female involvement. There's another question, actually. I think that we've actually addressed a lot of the questions in the Q&A, but there was a broader question as well, which I might throw to you. That there have been a few Westerners that have been captured by the Russians, and there's interest amongst our guests here about what some of the implications of that may be for Western governments, particularly those Western governments that actually kind of encouraged their citizens to travel. I wonder whether actually you could reflect on that, and perhaps we could get a few. Get the view of Mina and Casper on that point as well. But thanks, Bennett.
Yeah, for sure. I can't say I have a lot to add. I think a lot of it depends on what the particular situation of their capture is, specifically what kind of citizenship they have. I mean, one thing we learned from the handling of captive, again, completely different situation, but in Iraq and Syria when Western citizens were sort of detained how the individual governments came down on the question of repatriation depended highly upon what was going on in terms of the government's legal arrangements, what sort of things they had in place in terms of encouraging these types of prisoner transfers, and then the political situation as well. So I wouldn't want to speculate too much in terms of how different Western governments, or even in particular situations, whom are they captured by, those types of things. But suffice to say, I think any Westerner that gets captured in Ukraine who's participating is not going to have a particularly good time. Let's suffice it at that. In terms of the question of women as well, I'll briefly point out as well is that I think in the broader jihadist landscape, the North Caucasus was actually one of the fronts in which you saw, with some regularity, women operatives being deployed. They were given all sorts of labels in the media, such as shahidka in Russian, like a female shahid, or black widows, I guess, as they were colloquially called by the media. But women were responsible for a number of suicide bombings, and that ended up being the question on, or one of the questions on which the sort of more Al-Qaeda affiliated groups and individuals in the North Caucasus diverged from the Islamic State related officials, because in 2014, shortly after he took control of Imarat Kavkaz, the then leader Ali Ashab actually made a sort of injunction against using women in combat roles. And that was one of the factors that sort of led to the divergence over the long period of time between Imarat Kavkaz and the Islamic State in the North Caucasus.
We've run slightly over time here, but I do hope that our audience can stay with us for just a few more minutes, because I always like to, I guess, conclude these panels with I guess a bit of a myth busting process here. I guess if, you know, and Casper certainly identified a few in his opening remarks, but I'd actually, perhaps starting with Mina, if there was a myth that you would like busted, that you'd like to bust right now, particularly given the journalists that listen in, the policy people that listen in, about the jihadist response to to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, what would that myth be? And then Casper and Bennett.
That's a tricky one, and you always come to me first for these surprise questions. I guess it might be the assumption, maybe, that because jihadists are very, they consider Russia an enemy, and because of Russia's involvement in Syria and Afghanistan in the past, maybe that jihadists will kind of naturally be inclined to support Ukraine in the war, and that they might offer some kind of support in the war. And that hasn't been the case. And if you're looking at what sides they're taking, they're not taking sides largely, and they're thinking actually of the what they call the broader enemy, which is the West.
It's because of the great answers, Mina. Thank you. That was excellent. Casper.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the main, it's connected. There are two, but it's connected. So the denazification of Ukraine, and some of the people in the West broadly accepted that, right, left or center, saying, oh, you know, they're really those Nazis and nationalists and then what have you. Yes, they are, but I was trying to convince you that not that many, and they're not influential. And the recruitment efforts of foreigners are actually pretty paltry. And I think one thing we need to know is that Azov movement, not battalion, doesn't exist. That's one myth in itself. It's a Ukrainian entirety focused on Ukraine. You know, we sometimes think that this is an entirety focused on linking up with Atomwaffen division in the base in the United States. It is not. It is about certain things for Ukraine and in Ukraine. Now, I know we're all excited about it because it's a far-right paramilitary political party, the National Core, and we don't have far-right paramilitary political parties in our countries, but it still is a far-right party. And if you were to read its positions, in Ukrainian or Russian for that matter, you would see that it doesn't differ that much from quite a few of the far-right political forces in the West. Yet it still gets, you know, the rep it gets because of the connection with the battalion. So I think these are different entities. You know, you don't have to like them, but at least appreciate the fact that they're different.
Perfect. Thank you, Casper. And for the final word, Bennett. Thank you.
Yeah, Russian, especially FSB counterterrorism statistics are completely contrived, and you shouldn't take them at face value. And when the next stage of this war moves forward, regardless of whether it's jihadism or another violent extremist ideology, you should always look into, when the FSB says that it's conducting counterterrorism operations, into exactly what happened, what the nature of the arrest was, and what the individual sort of did in order to attain it. I'll conclude with a funny analogy from a couple days ago, and especially this points to some of Casper's comments as well. A couple days ago, the FSB conducted a sting operation, essentially, in which they arrested several individuals who were reportedly neo-Nazis who were planning attacks on several prominent Russian TV anchors. I won't go into the full details of the story, but suffice it to say, the command gave from FSB leadership, essentially, that they were supposed to be arrested with 3 Ukrainian SIM cards on their person in order to prove that they were neo-Nazis that were connected to sort of Ukraine and involved in sort of conducting these plots against Russian media outlets. What they ended up finding in some of the pictures is that the poor FSB agents had planted copies of The Sims 3, the video game. There's not 3 SIM cards, it's The Sims 3 on their person as well, and I guess which was a profound mix-up of the orders that they got from Bortnikov and from the top as well. Just a point in a longer thing of, it will be interesting to see if in the future there are future sort of Russian counterterrorism efforts against neo-Nazi groups, but not the ones that Casper talked about, ones with sort of a generally Ukrainian sort of orientation that are sort of contrived in that aspect in order to justify this broader argument that Ukraine is using neo-Nazi movements to destabilize Russia in the future. But any of that, whether it's jihadism, white supremacism, neo-Nazism, I would take any sort of Russian claim about counterterrorism operations with an entire bucket of salt.
Excellent. Thank you, Bennett. And by the way, please get on and see Bennett's latest publication, Imitators or Innovators. It's just been released today. Find it, read it, visit the Program on Extremism website. Thank you to Bennett, thank you to Casper, and thank you to Mina for an excellent panel. And until next time.
Thank you.